My grandmother had been in the ground for exactly 4 days when my phone lit up on the counter of her kitchen in Muskoka. I was rinsing out her favorite teacup, the one with the hand-painted chickadees that she'd used every single morning since my grandfather built the cottage in 1978, when I saw the notification from my sister. Landed in Tulum. Don't bother calling, we need the space. I set the teacup down on the tea towel very carefully, and I smiled, because I'd already moved the $385,000 out of the estate account 2 days before her flight boarded in Toronto. You have to understand something about my grandmother Edith and the cottage she left behind. The place on Lake Rosseau wasn't just a summer property on a title deed filed somewhere in Bracebridge. It was the place where I learned to swim off the end of the dock with my grandfather holding the back of my bathing suit. It was where my grandmother made butter tarts every Canada Day weekend until her hands got too stiff to roll the pastry. It was where my grandfather kept sitting in the same Muskoka chair every July-long weekend after she passed, eating store-bought butter tarts from the IGA in Port Carling because he refused to let anyone else bake hers. That cottage was a 3-bedroom cedar shake with a sleeping bunkie out back, a boathouse that needed restaining every second year, a 1,962 Chris Craft that my grandfather had maintained like it was a member of the family, and a GIC ladder at the local credit union that my grandmother had quietly built for almost 30 years to make sure the taxes and the roof and the septic would never be a reason anyone in the family had to sell. My grandmother told me this herself, sitting across from me at the kitchen table in her condo in North York, 6 months before the oncologist started using the phrase quality of life instead of treatment plan. She pushed a navy blue folder across the table to me. Hazel, she said, I need someone who understands this kind of thing to be in charge of it, not someone who just loves me. I've been working as an estate paralegal at a firm in Mississauga for 7 years. My grandmother knew exactly what she was doing the day she named me her executor. My older sister did not take that news well. My sister is 6 years older than me, which meant she spent our entire childhood treating that gap like a seniority badge she'd pinned on herself at birth. She's charming the way people who've never had to sit across from a loan officer are charming. She's got a laugh that fills a room, a way of making the waiter at Earl's feel like they're the most important person in the building, and a husband, my brother-in-law, who married her in a Caribbean destination wedding 11 years ago, that her maid of honor, our cousin Tara, is still paying the credit card bill for because my sister forgot to reimburse her for the flights. Together, they are the couple who always show up to Thanksgiving with an expensive bottle of Amarone and no casserole. Together, in the quieter spaces where I've watched them for years, they are a line of credit held together with a HELOC they took out on a house they couldn't really afford, in a neighborhood they couldn't really afford either, somewhere off Yonge Street in Richmond Hill. I watched them for years. I watched my sister borrow $12,000 from our grandmother to bridge her maternity leave when her first was born, and I watched that money never come back. I watched my brother-in-law convince my grandfather that the mahogany dining table in the condo had been promised to him, a promise no one else in the family had ever heard, and I watched him walk it out of the building on a dolly during a Boxing Day visit. I watched them show up at the cottage every August-long weekend, bring nothing, drink everything, and vanish until the next August. I watched my grandmother make excuses for them, the way women of her generation were taught to, with the kind of patience that gets mistaken for approval. After the diagnosis, things started shifting in ways that were so small you'd miss them if you weren't trained to notice. My grandmother's disease progressed slowly at first, which is somehow harder than fast because there's this long stretch where the person is still mostly herself, but the edges blur. She'd repeat the same story about the ice storm of '98. She'd look for her reading glasses while they were on her head. She'd pause in the middle of a sentence and then pivot like she hadn't. My sister started calling more. That was the first tell. She called with a kind of concern that sounded rehearsed. How was Grandma sleeping? Had Grandma seen the lawyer lately? Was the Muskoka property title still held jointly? Or had it been transferred into just Grandma's name after Grandpa passed? She framed every one of these questions as though she were simply a caring granddaughter trying to stay in the loop. My brother-in-law started showing up at the condo on random Sunday afternoons with grocery bags from the Loblaws down the street, which was notable because in 11 years of marriage to my sister, I had never once seen that man grocery shop. My grandmother was touched. She started saying things to me like, "Your sister's really making an effort, isn't she, Hazel?" And I'd smile and say, "She really is, Grandma," because I didn't want to spend any of the time we had left arguing about a woman who had decided, finally, at age 38, that our grandmother was worth a drive up the 404. My grandmother passed on a Wednesday evening in late September at the palliative care unit in Sunnybrook. The maples on the property up at the lake were already starting to turn. My husband Daniel had taken the week off, and he held my hand through the whole last hour, and when the nurse finally nodded at me, He didn't say anything. He just put his forehead against mine and let me cry without making it about him. My sister arrived at the cottage 2 days later for what we were calling the family gathering, even though the real service would be the following weekend at the funeral home in Toronto. Her husband trailed behind her carrying 2 tote bags from Holt Renfrew, which struck me as a strange choice of luggage for a weekend of grief at a Muskoka cottage in shoulder season. They stayed 4 nights. During those 4 nights, my sister asked me several interesting questions. She asked whether we could maybe delay filing the probate paperwork, just for a few weeks, because the whole family is still processing, and nobody needs the pressure of paperwork right now, Hazel. I told her that the timeline on probate in Ontario didn't really bend to our grief, and that we'd proceed as Grandma had wanted. She asked whether the estate could float her family's property tax bill that was coming due in November, just as an advance against what she'd be receiving anyway. I told her that disbursements from the estate would be handled through my office and the law firm's trust account, and that advances weren't something we were doing. She asked whether it made sense to list the cottage now, while the Muskoka market was still holding, rather than wait. I told her the terms of Grandma's will were very specific about the cottage staying in the family, and that selling wasn't on the table. After every one of these conversations, my sister would nod with a small, tight smile and say, "Right, of course. You know best." And then within 15 minutes, I'd hear her and her husband on the screened porch with their voices pitched low, in that way voices get when people are running through scenarios. I'm a paralegal. I know what that sounds like. On the last night, while Daniel was out on the dock watching the loons, my brother-in-law found me alone in the kitchen. He had this way of entering a room that felt engineered, like he'd watched a YouTube video on how to seem casual. He leaned against the counter and he poured himself a glass of Pinot he clearly did not need, and he said, very gently, "Hazel, you know, this is a lot for one person. My sister and I, we've been talking, we'd love to take some of this weight off you. Shared responsibility, that kind of thing." I thanked him. I said Grandma had been very clear about how she wanted this handled, and that the best way for everyone to support me was to let me do what she asked. He smiled. He didn't drink the wine. He left the glass on the counter next to the sink, still full. I lay awake that night in the guest bedroom under my grandmother's old patchwork quilt, going over every conversation we'd had in the last 6 weeks like I was cross-referencing a deposition. The questions about probate timing, the interest in the property, the offer to take things off my plate. And underneath all of it, the thing I'd been tracking quietly for almost 2 months, my sister and her husband's financial situation. I know more about their finances than they realize, which isn't because I went looking. It's because their lives leak at the seams. A cousin mentioned last Easter that their HELOC had been maxed. My sister's social media is a running advertisement for a life she can't afford. A new Range Rover lease, a backyard pool installed the same summer they were asking Grandma to cover their kids' hockey registration. I'd once been at their house helping with something for Mom's birthday, and a collection letter from RBC was sitting right on the front hall console table, the kind of letter a bank only sends after 3 missed payments. I'd noticed. I hadn't said anything. Noticing is just part of how I'm wired. What I'd noticed was that they were drowning, not obviously, not in any way a neighbor would clock, but drowning in the way that Canadians with a certain kind of income and a certain kind of lifestyle drown quietly, leveraged, one margin call away from the whole thing coming apart. My grandmother's estate, to a couple in that position, wasn't an inheritance. It was a lifeboat. 5 days after they drove back down the 400 to the city, I got a phone call from the credit union branch in Bracebridge, where my grandmother had held the cottage operating account for decades. Not just any call, a call from the branch manager, a woman named Gwen, who'd known my grandmother since before I was born and who had been at the funeral. Gwen was careful the way good bankers are careful when something has happened that they're not sure they're allowed to discuss yet. She said that someone claiming to be authorized by the estate had come into the branch in Parry Sound, not Bracebridge, which was notable, because nobody in my grandmother's life had ever banked in Parry Sound with a document claiming my grandmother had agreed, prior to her death, to pledge the $1,962 Chris Craft as collateral against a personal loan of $90,000. The document had my grandmother's signature on it. The signature had been notarized at a UPS store in a strip mall in Vaughan. Gwen had pulled the loan before it funded because the signature didn't match the one she had on file from every document my grandmother had signed at that branch since 1986. I sat in the gravel turnout at the side of Highway 11 with my hazards on for maybe 7 minutes before I said anything. Then I called Daniel. I told him what Gwen had told me. Daniel is the most level-headed person I've ever met, and he was quiet on the other end of the phone for a long stretch, and then he said, "Tell me what you need from me, and I'll do it." And I loved him more in that moment than I had on our wedding day, which is saying something. I told him I needed 24 hours. The next morning, I went into the firm. I pulled every document I had on my grandmother's estate. I called the notaries and commissioners section I had a contact at through work. I called the provincial notary public registry. I reached out to my supervising lawyer, a woman named Monique, and I walked her through the whole thing in her office with the door closed. She let me finish. Then she folded her hands on her desk the way she does, and she said very quietly, "You know what this is, right? Hazel?" I said, "Yes, I do." She said, "Tell me how you want to handle it, and I'll make sure we do this by the book, and I'll make sure nobody can ever say you didn't." I told her. She said, "I'll have the paperwork ready by end of day." The morning after that, I drove to the main credit union branch where Grandma's estate GICs and savings were held. I sat down across from the estate services officer with every document I had: the death certificate, the notarized will, my certificate of appointment, the letter's probate that had come through faster than I'd expected. I opened a new estate trust account in the name of the estate with myself and Daniel as co-signatories under supervision of the firm's trust account, which is standard practice for executors who want an additional layer of oversight when the estate is contested or potentially contested. I transferred $385,000. I left $18,000 in the original account. Enough that if anyone tried to pull the full amount, they would still see a balance. Enough to make them think the door was open. Then I went to the probate registry, and I filed every document, including a notice of potential estate fraud, which Monique had already drafted into a formal report being prepared for both the York Regional Police Financial Crimes Unit and the Law Society's notary fraud line. I went home. Daniel had made cedar plank salmon from the Sobeys at the corner of our street and roasted Brussels sprouts. He didn't ask. We ate. I slept through the night for the first time in 3 weeks. The text came 4 days later, right when I was rinsing out the chickadee teacup. Landed in Tulum. Don't bother calling, we need the space. I picked up the teacup again. I kept rinsing. I drove to the office. I pulled up the transaction history on the original estate account. There it was, an attempted wire transfer of $160,000, timestamped the day before my sister's flight. The wire had been rejected because the balance didn't support it. The routing information on the attempted transfer pointed to a personal checking account in my brother-in-law's name at a branch in Richmond Hill. I gave them 48 hours. Monique had advised me to wait. Let them settle in, she said. Let them feel safe. Let them start making choices from that place. People in that position always make worse choices when they think they've already won. I was betting on worse. The call came late Wednesday afternoon. I was at my desk reviewing a completely unrelated file for a client's estate when the phone rang with an international number I didn't recognize. I knew the country code. I let it ring twice. Then I picked up. Hazel. My sister's voice had that specific register I'd known since we were kids, the one that sounds like rage, but is actually panic trying to impersonate rage, because she'd rather die than be caught afraid. What did you do? I did my job, I said. I'm the executor. I secured the estate assets the way Grandma's will directed me to. That money. She stopped. I could hear something behind her, the specific sound of a resort pool and a Spanish voice calling out drink orders and the hollow echo of a villa made of marble. That money was supposed to be split evenly. That's what Grandma wanted. That's what she would have wanted if she'd been thinking clearly at the end. I know what Grandma wanted, I said. I have it in writing. What I also have in writing is a fraudulent loan application against her 1,962 Chris Craft submitted to a credit union in Perry Sound 3 days after her funeral, notarized at a UPS store by a notary who appears to have a prior professional relationship with your husband's accountant, a connection the Law Society's fraud unit is very interested in right now. Silence. I have the signature comparison that the branch manager pulled, I said. I have the security footage from the branch, which I've already requested a certified copy of. I have the notary's registration number, which traces back through the provincial registry in a way that's going to be very uncomfortable for several people. I have the Rogers Tower records from the night before the loan was submitted, which my firm obtained through the proper channels because we'd already filed the formal fraud report. Longer silence. Then the phone rustled, and my brother-in-law's voice came through. I'd been waiting for that. He always took the phone when things got past my sister's ability to improvise. Hazel. His voice was low, warm, that deliberate warmth certain men use when they're about to try to make you doubt yourself. Listen, I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. We were overwhelmed. Your sister was grieving. Things got handled badly. You know how much your grandmother meant to us. I know how much the Chris Craft was worth, I said. The loan was for $90,000. The boat was last insured at $112,000 through Grandma's personal lines policy. You needed fast money. Grandma wasn't here to say no. Hazel, come on. I also know, I said, keeping my voice completely level because I had rehearsed this drive in my car for 3 mornings in a row, that you and my sister have $47,000 in credit card debt across 4 cards, that your HELOC is calling and has been for 6 months, that your property tax installments on the Richmond Hill house are now 2 cycles behind, and that the consulting business you've been telling everyone at family events is really taking off is actually registered as inactive with the Ontario Business Registry. I'm not telling you this to be cruel. I'm telling you this so that you understand I am not operating on guesses. I did my homework. I did it quietly. I did it before you ever landed in Toronto for the funeral. He didn't say anything. I could hear my sister crying in the background. Not the performed kind, the other kind. "What do you want?" he said finally. The warmth was gone. I'd been ready for that question for 9 days. I told him I had 2 options laid out in writing. The way my grandmother always approached a hard conversation, clear, documented, no room to renegotiate later over a glass of wine at Christmas. Option 1. They flew home on the next available flight from Cancun. They came directly from Pearson to Monique's office in Mississauga. They signed, in front of her and in front of my husband and a witness we'd already arranged, a document permanently relinquishing any claim to contest the estate. In exchange, I would use estate funds to pay off the fraudulent loan they'd attempted, because even though the loan hadn't funded, there was still paperwork in motion that could have affected the Chris Crafts registration, and I needed that cleaned up. I would not personally pursue criminal charges for the forged signature, although I wanted to be very clear that the formal report I'd already filed was independent of me, and what the police and the Law Society did with it was no longer within my control. They would each receive the portion of the estate my grandmother had specified in the will, $22,000 each, plus a short list of personal items and nothing more. Option 2. I did not withdraw the fraud report. I filed a civil claim on behalf of the estate to recover every cost the attempted fraud had incurred, including Monique's time, which was billable and significant. I let the probate go contested, which in Ontario can take 12 to 24 months and generates court records that are public and searchable, and would sit on the first page of a Google search of their names for the rest of their working lives. I heard him exhale slowly, the way men do when they've just taken a punch they didn't see coming. "You'd really do this," he said, "to your own sister. And here's the thing about being the responsible one in a Canadian family. People use that against you. They count on it. They treat your reliability like it's a guarantee of your forgiveness. They believe, right up until the moment the evidence is spread on a conference table in front of them, that you will always pick the family over the truth, because you're the one who sends the birthday cards and hosts Christmas and drives mom to her appointments. They think your steadiness is a weakness they get to exploit forever. What they never account for is what happens when the person they've been counting on finally takes inventory." "I would," I said, "and I will, if that's the direction you choose. You have 48 hours to decide." They flew back on a Thursday. I didn't offer to pick them up from the airport. Daniel and I sat in Monique's conference room on the 8th floor of her building downtown, with the view of the lake out the window and 2 folders on the table. Monique greeted them at the door the way she greets every client who has brought a mess with them professionally, warmly, with zero emotional investment in the outcome, and then she sat down and said, "Shall we begin?" I slid the folders across. My sister didn't open hers. She kept her hands flat on the table, palms down, the way you do when you're trying not to shake. My brother-in-law opened his and read, and I watched the color leave his face in sections, the way it does when someone is reading a document they had quietly convinced themselves didn't actually exist. "Folder 1, I said, because I'd rehearsed it, is the full accounting of the estate as it stands, including the transfer I made as executor, which was lawful and fully documented. Folder 2 is the evidence package, the loan application, the notarization records, the Rogers metadata, the branch manager's signed statement, and a copy of the formal complaint that has already been filed with the appropriate authorities." My sister finally looked up at me. "Hazel," she said quietly, in a voice I hadn't heard since we were 12, "please." I looked at her across the table. I thought about the butter tarts. I thought about the dock. I thought about every single time I had driven up to Muskoka alone to open the cottage for the season because nobody else ever did. I thought about my grandmother pushing the Navy folder across the table at me and saying, "I need someone who understands this kind of thing." "Sign page 7, I said. "Initial pages 3, 4, and 11. She signed. He signed. The scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room, and then Monique closed the folders and said, "Thank you both. We'll be in touch through counsel going forward," which is how lawyers politely say, "Don't ever call me at home." Daniel drove us home in silence through the evening traffic on the Gardner. He didn't ask me how I felt until we were in our kitchen with the door closed and the kettle on. Then he just looked at me. I thought about my grandmother in the cedar chair on the dock, eating butter tarts from the IGA, and watching the sun set over the west shore of Rosseau every July-long weekend after Grandpa died, because she believed in keeping the ritual even when the reason for it was gone. "I'm okay," I said. And I meant it not in the sense of triumphant or proud, but in the sense of intact. Still here. Still me. The estate closed 5 months later. The cottage on Lake Rosseau went to Daniel and me, just as the will specified, because my grandmother had known, in the way women like her always knew, which of her grandchildren would actually take care of a place versus which of them would list it. The Chris Craft went to a maritime museum in Gravenhurst that my grandfather had been a patron of for 30 years. The bulk of the liquid estate went into a scholarship fund at the community college in Bracebridge, where my grandmother had volunteered tutoring adult literacy students until the last year of her life. My sister received her $22,000 and a box of our grandmother's jewelry, most of which she sold within a month. I know because it ended up on a consignment site I happened to be scrolling through one night. That's fine. It was hers. What surprised me in the months afterward wasn't the grief, which I had expected, or the relief, which I had also expected. It was something quieter than either of those. My grandmother had spent her whole life believing that family meant you kept extending grace, no matter what, no matter how many times. Because closing the door was a kind of failure she couldn't bring herself to accept. I used to think I agreed with her. But there's a difference between an open door and an unlocked vault. Grace is something you offer freely, again and again, because it's who you are. It isn't an obligation to hand someone the keys to everything you were trusted to protect and then hope they'll finally, this time, make the right choice. Sometimes protecting the people who deserve protecting the ones who are gone, the ones who are still here, the ones who haven't been born yet means making a choice that looks, from the outside, like coldness. It isn't coldness, it's stewardship. My grandmother chose me as her executor because she knew I would do what needed to be done, not what was easy, not what kept the peace, not what made everyone at Christmas dinner comfortable. What needed to be done. The cottage still has the dock. I go up most weekends, Daniel and I can get away, right through the shoulder seasons and into the late fall when the lake turns that specific kind of pewter gray it turns in November. I sit in my grandmother's cedar chair with a cup of tea in the chickadee cup and I watch the light come off the water. I bring butter tarts, real ones now, made from the recipe card I found tucked into her joy of cooking in the condo, in her handwriting, with the margins full of her own edits in pencil. I sit in that chair, and I think about what it means to carry something forward. Not the hurt, not the anger, not the exhausting invisible labor of being the person everybody leaned on without ever quite seeing. Just the cottage, the light, the quiet you finally get to feel when the door is closed, and the right things are behind it, and the right things are outside it, and you were the one who knew the difference. My grandmother would have liked that, I think. She always said the best thing about the cottage was that it was a place where you didn't have to be anyone other than exactly who you were. It took me a long time to understand what she meant. I think I finally do.